Tonight, we turn our attention to a figure often cloaked in soot and forgotten by history's spotlight, the medieval blacksmith. Not the cinematic version, hammering swords in rhythmic slow-motion grandeur, but the real one. The man whose life was blistered by fire, whose lungs choked on ash, and whose days were marked not just by the clang of metal, but by the cries of the wounded. In a world where medicine was as crude as the roads, and faith was often the only prescription, the blacksmith stood as a strange, smoky beacon of practicality. He wasn't just the one who fixed horseshoes and hammered out nails. He was the one you ran to when your leg broke, when your tooth throbbed, or when infection crawled across your skin like a curse. In the dim, roaring mouth of the forge, this man became more than a tradesman. He became an emergency room, a last resort, a necessary gamble when all else failed. It's strange to think about now, in a world of antiseptics and surgical gloves. But in those dark times, the man holding tongs and a hammer was sometimes the only person with both the tools and the nerve to try to save you. There were no clean clinics, no hospitals in most villages. A trained physician, if you could afford one, might be days away and not much help when he arrived. But the blacksmith, he was always there. He had tools that could pull, cut, or burn. He had fire hot enough to sear wounds shut. And more importantly, he had the kind of brutal experience that comes from watching people limp in and either walk out or not. In many ways, the blacksmith's forge was the medieval world's unspoken clinic, hidden in plain sight. Its walls echoed not just with the ring of iron on steel, but with the groans of pain, the hush of desperate parents, the grit of someone biting down on leather as hot metal kissed a wound. These were not trained procedures. There were no books, no diagrams, no sterile instruments. There was only intuition, repetition, and the raw understanding that something had to be done. Over time, the blacksmith became more than a figure of muscle and sparks. He was part craftsman, part healer, part local legend. His skills stitched the community together. Nails for the barn, hinges for the door, splints for the broken leg, forceps to pull a rotten tooth. He didn't ask questions. He didn't promise miracles. But he was there when no one else was, and sometimes that was enough. So tonight, as we drift into the strange, smoky world of medieval life, we're not just talking about hammers and anvils. We're talking about healing through heat, survival through steel, and the unexpected ways in which one man, covered in soot and firelight, held the fate of a village in his scarred hands. The forge never truly slept. Even before dawn, the coals whispered and glowed like the eyes of something alive, something hungry. By the time the village rooster cried out its weary greeting, the blacksmith was already awake, already sweating, already working. His hands, scabbed, cracked, permanently stained with soot, gripped the same tools he'd used yesterday and the day before that. The air was thick with heat, not warmth, but a choking, aggressive heat that clung to your lungs like wet wool and made every breath feel like inhaling smoke off a battlefield. The floor was dark with ash and sweat, a mix of mud and iron filings that never fully dried. Flames danced in the hearth, casting shadows across the curved backs of tools and the bent spine of the man who used them. This wasn't a place of elegance or peace. It was a chamber of relentless labor, where noise reigned supreme and time bent around the fire's hunger. The blacksmith's day was a series of punishments masquerading as tasks. Heat the metal, strike the metal, shape the metal, repeat until your shoulders lock and your hearing fades beneath the rhythm of the hammer. It was the kind of exhaustion that didn't wear off after a night's sleep. It settled in your bones, turned muscle into stone, and made you forget what it meant to not ache. Every movement came with a wince. Every swing of the hammer rang through your teeth. But there was no stopping. If he paused, the metal cooled. If the metal cooled, the job was ruined. If the job was ruined, the village would come knocking with anger in their fists and no coin in their hands. And so the blacksmith worked, tirelessly, endlessly, because that's what survival required. But this was not just a place where metal bent and blades were born. The forge had another identity, one rarely spoken aloud, but deeply understood by those who lived nearby. It was the place you went when your options had run dry, when your leg was broken, when the bone jutted wrong, when the fever wouldn't break, and your mouth was full of rotted teeth. You didn't call for a priest. You walked, or were carried, to the blacksmith. He didn't advertise this role. He didn't hang up a sign that read, "Healer," and no one ever called him that. But he had tools. He had fire. He had strong hands and a tolerance for screams. In a world that rarely gave you choices, he became the one you turned to when you needed something fixed, whether it was a plowshare or a shattered arm. So yes, the forge was a brutal place, a prison of sweat and sparks and constant noise, but hidden beneath the layers of ash and iron was something more. A grim kind of hope, a strange trust, built not on knowledge or science, but on the simple fact that when pain came, the blacksmith was there. And he had a way of making things whole again, even if it hurt like hell. By the standards of the time, a medieval blacksmith's forge might as well have been the town's emergency room. Not by design, not by law, and certainly not by training, but by sheer necessity. People didn't think of it that way, not openly. No one said, "Take him to the forge," in the way we might say, "Get him to a hospital." But they did, again and again. Because when someone slipped with a scythe, or took a hoof to the ribs, or coughed up something black that wouldn't go away, they didn't look for a physician. They went to the place with heat, tools, and someone who could handle blood without flinching. The blacksmith didn't wear a white coat. He didn't keep records or ask about symptoms. But he had iron tongs. He had brute strength. And, most importantly, he was willing to do what needed to be done, whether that meant pulling a nail from a foot or burning an infection out of a wound. Inside the forge, the air was always alive, not just with smoke, but with movement, with the thick buzz of human desperation. 1 hour, the blacksmith might be repairing a broken cart axle. The next, he'd be holding down a screaming farmer while trying to realign a dislocated shoulder with a splint he shaped from spare wood and leather. His workbench, lined with hammers, files, and chisels, doubled as an operating table when the situation called for it. The tools were not clean, but they were hot, searing hot. Sometimes that was enough. The fire became an accidental miracle. Metal tools, heated to glowing, were in fact killing germs no one could name. The forge, in its chaos and brutality, stumbled into something close to hygiene long before the word existed. No one understood bacteria, but they understood that things hurt less after the burn, or at least didn't fester as quickly. People came limping in, hunched and trembling, sometimes carried on the backs of relatives, sometimes bleeding through cloth. The smith didn't ask many questions. He looked, he judged, he moved fast. You didn't get small talk here. You got pain, immediate, sharp, unfiltered. The blacksmith was not gentle. He didn't promise it would feel better, but he did what others wouldn't dare. He acted. If a tooth had to come out, it came out. If a wound had to be cleaned, he cleaned it, with hot iron, not water. If a limb had to be set, he braced it with rawhide and clamps, and said, "Don't move." In that moment, his forge transformed. The hiss of metal in water, the snap of the bellows, it all became part of a cruel but vital ritual. Somewhere between blacksmithing and surgery, he stitched together survival with soot-covered hands and a heart that had long since learned to ignore the screaming. The villagers never called it medicine. They didn't need to. They just knew that if the pain was unbearable, the blacksmith was their best shot. Not the priest, not the healer who mumbled over herbs. The man with the iron, the man with the fire, the man who didn't promise salvation, but might, just might, keep you alive another day. The blacksmith's tools were never meant to heal people, but that didn't stop them. In the flickering light of the forge, iron became whatever it needed to be. A pair of tongs, originally designed to hold glowing metal, could just as easily pull a rotten tooth from a screaming mouth. A hammer, meant to shape swords and hinges, could be turned gently, or not so gently, against a dislocated shoulder, popping it back into place with a sickening crunch and a whispered prayer. The anvil, stained with years of sweat and soot, was as likely to see blood as it was to see bronze. This was the strange reality of medieval life. The same bench where a knight's armor was repaired might host a barefoot peasant begging for relief from a festering wound. And the tools? They never changed. What mattered was who held them, and whether they were willing to use them for something far messier than metal. Every piece on the workbench had a second life. The chisel, sharp enough to score steel, could also cut through infected flesh. The punch tool, meant to pierce metal, sometimes served as a crude trephine when someone's skull needed relieving. The bellows were for the fire, but could just as easily be used to fan a person in the throes of fever or keep smoke away from a wound, as it was cauterized. The blacksmith didn't call these tools medical instruments. He just knew how they worked, knew their weight, their grip, the way they bit into matter, and sometimes that was all it took. In an age when licensed surgeons were rare, expensive, and often lethal in their own right, the blacksmith's familiarity with pain and pressure was its own kind of education. Cauterization was one of his most brutal talents. The same iron used to bend hinges could be reheated and pressed to a wound with terrifying precision. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't safe, but it stopped the bleeding. That hiss, that awful sizzle as hot iron met torn flesh, became the sound of survival. People feared it. Some passed out. Others bit down on leather straps or the grip of a neighbor's hand. But they came back afterward, sometimes limping, sometimes trembling, always burned, but alive. And they remembered. Not the pain exactly, but the man who wielded the iron with the steadiness of someone who'd done it before and would do it again. There was no such thing as specialized equipment in the village. You had what you had, and the blacksmith, more than anyone, had the tools and the mindset to adapt. He wasn't squeamish. He didn't flinch. He'd seen things worse than blood. His world was already soaked in injury. The burns, the gashes, the smashed fingers. What was one more emergency? One more tooth? One more shattered limb? One more piece of a human body in need of repair? To the blacksmith, it was all the same. Iron bent, flesh tore. Both could be shaped again if you were strong enough to hold steady and brave enough to try. He earned his reputation not with titles or diplomas, but with calluses, burns, and blood under his nails. The blacksmith wasn't anyone's first choice as a healer. He was the last resort. But over time, last resort became quiet legend. In a world where survival often depended on who was brave enough to act, the blacksmith's forge became something more than a place for shoeing horses or shaping hinges. It became a place where people went not for perfection, but for hope. He didn't pretend to be a doctor. There was no pretense, no ceremony, just scars, strength, and a grim willingness to do what others couldn't. In a town of 50 souls, reputation spread like fire. People whispered about the time he reset a shepherd's jaw with a pair of pliers, or when he saved a child's arm by cauterizing a cut no one else dared touch. No one asked him how he knew what to do. They just thanked him, if they were lucky enough to still be breathing afterward. That respect didn't come easy. At first, some feared him more than trusted him. They saw the smoke, the burns, the noise, and thought of punishment more than healing. But then, someone's cousin came back from the forge still limping, but with their legs still attached. Then someone's sister got a rotting tooth pulled and stopped crying herself to sleep. Slowly, the fear began to fade, replaced by a wary kind of reverence. He never smiled when they thanked him. Sometimes he didn't even respond. He wasn't doing it for gratitude. He was doing it because someone had to. Because when a man came to his door, pale and staggering with a wound that stank of rot, the smith didn't send him away. He set down his work, rolled up his sleeves, and did what he could. Even if it meant burning flesh. Even if it meant screams loud enough to silence the anvil. In a strange way, the forge itself became part of his legend. The villagers began to see the fire not just as a tool, but as something sacred, a purifier, a cleanser. The heat that could kill also saved. And in the center of it all was the blacksmith, half craftsman, half executioner, half miracle worker. No one could explain it, least of all him. But people trusted results, and while the priest offered prayers and the healer offered herbs, the blacksmith offered action. Raw, brutal, immediate action. Not everyone survived it, but far more did than if they'd done nothing at all. His reputation, over time, became a quiet armor. It didn't make him rich. It didn't make him famous. But it made people knock on his door when they had nowhere else to go. It made them look him in the eye and say, "Please." And it made them forgive the pain when the cure came wrapped in fire and fear. He wasn't a doctor. He was something older, something rougher, and, in many cases, something far more effective. It wasn't uncommon for villagers to call him the bone setter, though never to his face. The title hung around the blacksmith like a second apron, earned, not declared. In the same way he understood the tension of a sword blade or the balance of a wagon axle, he came to understand the human body. Not from books, not from training, but from necessity, observation, and the simple logic of survival. If something bent the wrong way, you forced it back. If it stuck out, you pushed it in. There were no second opinions, no x-rays, just the blacksmith's judgment and the terrified silence of someone waiting for pain. He became known not just for his forge, but for the way he could walk into a room, glance at a twisted ankle or dislocated shoulder, and say, with no ceremony, "Hold him still." There was a rhythm to it, a crude sort of ritual that began with boiling water, torn cloth, and a large piece of wood to bite. The smith's hands, massive, cracked, and blackened, became tools in themselves. He didn't ask how it happened. He didn't need the story. He just took the limb in question, braced it against his chest or thigh, and with a swift, brutal movement, forced it back into place. The snap was unmistakable. The scream was expected. And then, almost always, came the silence. The kind of silence that meant the pain had shifted, from chaos to something more manageable, from sharp agony to dull shock. And for the blacksmith, that was the goal. You weren't healed, but you were back on the path to wholeness. Word of his skill traveled farther than his metalwork ever did. A boy from a nearby hamlet arrived one morning, carried on his brother's back, his arm dangling uselessly after a fall. The smith didn't hesitate. He cut away the shirt, felt along the swollen joint, and pushed. The pop echoed like a mallet striking iron. The boy cried. The brother looked pale, but the arm stayed in place. Days later, the family sent back a loaf of hard bread and a small bag of dried beans, payment in kind. The blacksmith nodded once and went back to his forge. That was all the thanks he needed. The strange thing was, he often did a better job than the so-called physicians who passed through from time to time. They came with perfumes and pouches of herbs, with theories and fees, and most of the time they caused more harm than good. They set bones wrong. They hesitated. They bled patients who didn't need bleeding. But the blacksmith, he worked like the fire he stood over. Fast, hot, unflinching. And though no one would ever confuse his forge for a clinic, more than one person would quietly admit that if their life or limb was on the line, they'd take his hands over a scholar's any day. In that way, he became something more than a craftsman. He was a silent guardian of the village's working limbs, a man who could pound iron into shape and just as easily coax a broken shoulder back into place with the same steady confidence. And somehow, over time, no one questioned it. The bone setter simply was. Of all the horrors that crawled their way into the blacksmith's forge, none were quite so dreaded or so memorable as the moment someone staggered in, clutching their jaw, swollen cheek, a face twisted with pain, and eyes already wet from sleepless nights. Everyone in the village knew what came next. When a tooth went bad in the Middle Ages, there were no gentle options. There were no numbing agents, no antiseptic rinses, no waiting rooms with calming music. There was only the blacksmith, the fire, and a pair of iron tongs heated for too long in the coals. He didn't advertise dental services, and he certainly didn't enjoy them. But when someone was writhing in agony, when the infection crept up the neck and into the eye, when the pain became something closer to madness, people came knocking on the smithy's door with desperation in their voices. He didn't ask questions. He just wiped his hands, tied a leather strap around the victim's forehead, and gestured for them to sit, if they could. Sometimes it happened right there on the floor, between anvils and buckets, with a forge roaring beside them, and the metallic scent of iron mixing with fear and saliva. His tools weren't built for teeth, but he adapted. Modified pliers filed to a sharper point. Iron tongs narrowed with every tooth he pulled. They weren't delicate instruments. They didn't need to be. The blacksmith relied on grip and brute force. He'd wedge the tool around the rotted molar, press a firm hand to the patient's head, and pull. Sometimes it came out clean. Sometimes it cracked halfway, leaving fragments behind that would rot for weeks. Either way, the scream was the same, raw, guttural, and unfiltered. The kind of scream that echoed against the forge's stone walls and made even the horses outside go quiet. There were no guarantees. Infection could still follow. Sometimes the bleeding didn't stop. Sometimes the swelling worsened. But sometimes, just often enough, the pain was gone. The fever broke. The patient walked away clutching a bloodied rag and offering whatever payment they could manage. A sack of grain, a handful of eggs, a whispered thanks. The blacksmith never asked for more. He only cleaned his tongs, set them back in the coals, and waited for the next poor soul to come limping through the door. And yet, despite the agony and the risk, people trusted him. Not because he was kind, but because he was honest. He didn't lie about what it would feel like. He didn't pretend to be a healer. He just did what had to be done when no one else could. In a world without options, that counted for everything. So in the long list of brutal necessities that made up the blacksmith's strange resume, setting bones, stitching wounds, branding infections, it was dentistry by firelight that most villagers whispered about at night, because everyone knew, sooner or later, that pain in your jaw could become unbearable. And when it did, you'd end up in that forge, biting down on leather, staring into fire, and praying to gods you didn't believe in while the blacksmith ripped the agony from your skull. There were few medical theories in the medieval world more widespread or more misunderstood than bloodletting. The belief that illness stemmed from imbalances in the body's humors led people to seek out anyone with a knife and a steady hand, hoping that opening a vein might draw out the sickness festering inside. And in the absence of trained barbers or licensed surgeons, it often fell to the blacksmith to do the bleeding. It was ironic, really. The same man who forged swords to spill blood on the battlefield was now tasked with spilling it carefully, deliberately, in the name of healing. Not because he understood the body's mysteries, but because he had blades sharp enough to cut, and because he wasn't afraid to do what had to be done. It wasn't elegant. A man might arrive feverish, coughing, or complaining of mysterious aches. The priest would mutter prayers. The herbalist would mix a bitter paste. But the blacksmith, he'd clean a small blade in the fire, press a cloth against the skin, and slice. Not deep, just enough to let the blood flow. He didn't know why it sometimes helped. No one did. But on occasion, the patient would walk out with a clearer head and steadier feet, the fever broken. More often, though, it was a ritual of desperation, a final attempt when all else had failed, a gamble against death. And like all things in the forge, it was done with no ceremony, no comfort, just the hiss of the fire and the soft, steady drip of blood onto dirt. Worse than bloodletting, however, was branding, not for punishment, though it carried the same violence, for healing. Infection was a constant threat. Wounds turned black, skin blistered, fevers burned through families. And when infection wouldn't retreat, people turned to fire. The blacksmith's tools, always glowing, always ready, became instruments of last resort medicine. He would take a rod from the embers, hold it steady as it sizzled with heat, and press it directly onto the flesh. The goal was simple: to kill the rot, to cauterize the wound, to scare away death itself. The pain was unimaginable. The sound of it, the wet sear, the cry of the patient, stayed in the walls of the forge long after the act was done. Yet it wasn't madness. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. The same logic that forged iron into armor believed that fire could save a limb or a life. And sometimes it did. The infection stopped. The swelling faded. The patient limped home with a scar, but also with a heartbeat. And for many, that was enough. There was no applause, no records, just the quiet understanding that pain, however brutal, was sometimes the price of staying alive. The blacksmith didn't speak of these things. He didn't consider himself a healer, but he knew where to place the blade. He knew how hot the iron needed to be, and he knew how to hold someone down while they screamed, because he'd done it dozens of times, maybe hundreds. The fire that forged tools also forged flesh, and in that crucible of smoke, steel, and human pain, he carved out a role no one asked for, but everyone needed. War was chaos, but what came after was worse. When the trumpets faded and the bodies stopped falling, the real suffering began, and in village after village, it was the blacksmith who faced the broken remnants of battle. Men came dragging themselves through mud, clutching shattered limbs, armor twisted around mangled bodies like rusted cages. There were no army medics, No organized hospitals, just a trail of blood and groaning that ended at the forge. Because where else could you go when your arm was crushed and your helmet had to be cut from your head? Who else had the strength to pull off a dented breastplate without taking your ribs with it? Who else could bend steel, hammer it flat again, and turn the tools of war into makeshift salvation? The answer was always the same: the blacksmith. He never volunteered. He didn't go looking for wounded men. But they came, in ones and twos, then by the dozen, some carried by comrades, some crawling through fields with dried blood in their beards and arrows still lodged in their thighs. They brought their wounds and their weapons in the same breath, and the blacksmith treated both. He pulled nails from feet and bolts from flesh. He straightened twisted breastplates with the same anvil he used for wagon wheels. A dented shield might become a leg brace. A broken sword guard could be reforged into a crutch. The forge became a strange sanctuary, a place of iron and agony, where men screamed louder than the bellows and begged for anything that would let them walk again. There was no battlefield triage, no morphine, only hot iron, cold steel, and the blacksmith's grim resolve. He worked with what he had: scrap leather for bindings, horseshoes reshaped into splints, old chainmail melted and molded into crude braces. It was a brutal kind of innovation, born not from creativity, but from sheer necessity. When the choice was between limping with a hammered-together brace or losing the leg entirely, no one asked for elegance. They asked for speed. They asked for strength. They asked to live. And so the blacksmith became something between a surgeon and a mechanic, repairing not just tools of war, but the men who wielded them. He'd heat a poker and burn through rotted flesh to reach what was still living underneath. He'd bind wounds with the same rough hands that shaped blades, and when necessary, he'd amputate a limb with a saw meant for bone and oak alike. It was crude, violent work. But in those days, it was that or die. The villagers noticed, not just the blood on his apron, but the men who walked again, limping, yes, scarred forever, yes, but alive. The knight with a mended leg brace, the farmer-turned-soldier with a jaw wired shut by a length of hammered copper. These weren't miracles. They were the blacksmith's cold, hard mercy. War didn't just break bodies. It made healers out of men who had no choice. And in that smoke-choked forge, under the weight of steel and silence, the blacksmith did what no one else could. He put broken warriors back together, one glowing ember at a time. In the medieval world, the word doctor didn't carry the comfort it does today. A physician, if one could even be found, was often a man of robes and books, not results. He might arrive with an entourage, a purse full of exotic herbs, and 1,000 theories about the balance of humors. But when a villager was dying from a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, or a fever that refused to break, all the education in the world meant little if the man couldn't fix the problem. These doctors were expensive, elusive, and in many cases, less helpful than the local blacksmith with a bucket of water, a red-hot poker, and the guts to use both. Medicine at the time was as much performance as practice. Physicians preferred noble houses, not smoke-stained villages. They were far more comfortable diagnosing the king's indigestion than digging an arrowhead out of a farmhand's thigh. And so, while physicians debated causes and consulted stars, the blacksmith acted. He didn't claim to understand why someone was sick or what mystical imbalance caused pain. He didn't need to. He looked at a problem: swollen limb, gaping wound, tooth gone rotten, and solved it the way he solved everything else, with force, with fire, and with a focus so sharp it bordered on frightening. Where a physician might bleed a man dry for a headache, the blacksmith would drain an abscess with a glowing blade and send the patient home, scorched but surviving. One worked with parchment and prayer, the other with smoke and instinct, and the village knew the difference. The contrast was brutal. A physician might arrive once a year, if at all. His cures were slow, expensive, and often ineffective. He might recommend charms, leeches, or foul-smelling pastes. Meanwhile, the blacksmith was always there. His treatments weren't delicate, and they certainly weren't gentle, but they worked often enough that people came back. Not because they trusted him to save them, but because he was the only one who didn't flinch, the only one who acted. He didn't wait for signs or symbols. He heated the iron. He held the blade. He cut, burned, pulled, braced, whatever it took. If it meant saving a life, he did it. Without theory, without approval, and without apologies. The truth is, for most peasants, the blacksmith was more doctor than any man who wore rings and spoke Latin. They didn't care about university training. They cared about who could stop the bleeding, who could pull the tooth, who could set the bone. And time and again, that person wasn't the learned physician riding in with scrolls. It was the man with soot on his hands and sparks in his beard. The one who'd seen more real injuries than any textbook could ever describe. The one who got things done. Because in a world where survival often came down to action over answers, the blacksmith was the one they trusted most. The blacksmith didn't know the word sterilization. He'd never heard of germs, and he couldn't have explained bacteria if his life depended on it. But by some strange stroke of luck, or perhaps the brutal logic of his trade, he had been working with one of the few things in the medieval world that could actually kill disease: fire. Day in and day out, he handled tools that were repeatedly heated to temperatures high enough to sear flesh and melt steel. Tongs, chisels, blades, spikes. They all passed through the belly of the forge before being put to use. And while he thought only of malleability and strength, something else was happening in that fire. Something far more important. The heat was cleansing. It burned away the invisible rot that clung to iron and wood and flesh. It did what no herb or prayer could ever do. It purified. No one called it hygiene. No one recognized it for what it was. But the villagers noticed, in their own quiet way, that wounds sealed with a hot poker didn't fester like the ones treated with poultices. That iron tools, glowing from the fire, left behind less sickness than knives sharpened and stored in the dark. They couldn't explain it. They didn't try. But they came back, again and again, to the place where pain and healing lived side by side in the heat. The forge, choked with smoke and echoing with hammer strikes, was also, paradoxically, cleaner than most homes. The fire never stopped burning. The tools were always being remade, reheated, reforged. Infection, though still a deadly threat, stood less of a chance here than in the hands of a wandering herbalist with a rusted scalpel and a bag of moldy roots. There was a strange, accidental wisdom in the blacksmith's routine. Before he performed any kind of crude procedure, he instinctively heated his tools. Not to clean them, he wouldn't have used that word, but because hot metal worked better. It cut easier, cauterized faster, didn't bend under pressure. But that very heat killed the unseen killers that haunted the medieval world. The forge became a crucible not only for iron, but for life and death decisions made cleaner by fire. Even the wounds themselves, when sealed by a glowing rod, had a better chance of survival. The skin burned closed, the blood stopped. The infection often had no path left to travel. It was an agonizing process, but compared to the slow rot of untreated flesh, It was a miracle, a terrible, screaming miracle. And so, without understanding the science, the blacksmith became one of the few people in a filthy, disease-ridden world who accidentally practiced something close to modern cleanliness. He would never claim that title. He'd never see himself as a healer of any kind. But in an age where filth was the default and infection was a sentence, his forge stood as a strange, smoky sanctuary. A place where fire didn't just shape metal, it unknowingly saved lives. The blacksmith didn't work alone, not always. As much as his forge was a sanctuary of fire and steel, there were times when iron wasn't enough. In the shadows beyond the village road, or nestled in the corner of the market, there lived another kind of healer, a wise woman, an herbalist, a midwife with fingers stained green instead of black, who knew what the blacksmith didn't. She didn't carry tongs or forge blades, but she had roots that dulled pain and powders that stopped bleeding. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance. He handled the wounds you could see, and she dealt with the ones you couldn't. Their methods were different, but their goals were the same. When a man came in with a gash too wide to close with pressure alone, the blacksmith would sear the flesh while she crushed leaves into a cooling paste. He burned infection out with red-hot iron, and she followed behind with comfrey to ease the swelling. If a child had a fever that no fire could fix, she came with bitter teas and prayers whispered in the old tongue. If a woman's birth went wrong, she called on the smith, not for comfort, but for strength, for the only man in town strong enough to hold the body still, if it came to that. And when the blacksmith had to pull a tooth, she gave the patient something to chew, a numbing root, if she had it, a charm, if she didn't. Their work was a duet in survival. She trusted the blacksmith's hands, not because they were gentle, but because they were sure. He trusted her not because he understood her plants, but because he'd seen the swelling go down, the rashes fade, the fevers break after her visits. He didn't ask what she used. Sometimes he didn't want to know. There were rumors, always, about women who knew too much. Some called them witches. Others called them saints. The line was thin. But the blacksmith knew better than to care. Results mattered. The rest was noise. They didn't always agree. She'd argue for patience and poultices. He'd argue for immediate action and cautery. She believed in nature's rhythm. He believed in brute solutions. But when things went wrong, when the wound wouldn't close or the mother wouldn't stop bleeding, they stood side by side, sweat on their brows, doing everything they could to keep the person breathing. Villagers noticed, though no one said it aloud. They'd whisper about the Iron Man and the Ivy Woman, two opposites who somehow kept the town alive when no one else could. He was fire and smoke. She was leaf and shadow. Together, they formed a kind of crude rural medicine that worked more often than it should have. And in the chaos of medieval life, where illness could strike like lightning and death lurked behind every cough or cut, their uneasy partnership became something rare and precious. Hope. No one would carve their names into stone, but their work lived on in the bodies they stitched, burned, soothed, and saved. A scar across a soldier's leg, a child's toothless grin, a mother still breathing. These were their legacy, carved not in monuments, but in survival. The village blacksmith knew horses better than most men knew their own kin. He had studied their gait, their weight, their weaknesses. He could tell by the sound of a hoof on packed dirt whether something was wrong. He knew the joints, the way a leg bent, the way weight shifted across the body, the signs of strain and fracture. And when a horse went lame, it was his job to fix it. He'd lift the massive leg with practiced ease, examine the damage, and go to work with files, clamps, and nails. He built braces to support twisted ankles. He shaped iron to protect cracked hooves. He watched carefully, adjusted slowly, and listened, not to words, but to movement. And over time, the villagers noticed something strange. The same man who could mend a horse's stride could mend a human's too. It wasn't a leap of logic. It was necessity. When a farmer fell and his leg bent sideways, there was no doctor to call. But the blacksmith had already straightened worse. He'd seen bones mend, seen limbs regain their strength, all with the right support and pressure. So they came to him, not with faith, but with desperation. And the blacksmith did what he always did. He adapted. A broken forearm became a smaller version of a splinted fetlock. A dislocated knee was treated like a stubborn hoof joint. Leather straps carved wood, heated metal rods shaped to fit a limb. These became the crude materials of his makeshift orthopedics. He didn't speak of anatomy. He didn't need to. He knew alignment. He knew how one wrong angle meant ruin, whether it was a horse's hock or a man's elbow. He had seen the way weight travels through bone and muscle, and he applied that same intuition to the people who hobbled into his forge. A shepherd with a crooked ankle, a child with a twisted wrist. He braced them, bound them, and told them not to move, and most of the time, it worked. They left stiff and sore, but still walking, and when they returned weeks later, favoring the limb but whole again, they thanked him in quiet ways. Eggs, bread, a repaired fence. That was all the thanks he needed. It wasn't unusual for someone to stand beside a forge fire, shirtless and pale, while the blacksmith measured a splint against their bruised arm. The same tools he used to bend horseshoes now turned to holding human limbs in place. The same rasp that smoothed the edge of iron now dulled the edge of a wooden brace. And it didn't matter that his forge smelled of sweat and smoke rather than antiseptic. What mattered was that people healed. Some of the more superstitious villagers whispered that he must have been blessed. How else could a man who spent his life with beasts be so good at fixing people? But the truth was simpler. He understood structure. He understood pressure. He understood pain. And in a world without instruction manuals or medical degrees, that was more than enough. The line between horses and humans blurred in the blacksmith's forge. Bones were bones, joints were joints, and when they failed, someone had to put them right. The blacksmith just happened to be the only one strong enough to do it. Pain, in the medieval world, wasn't an event. It was a condition, constant, expected, woven into daily life, like hunger or cold. People didn't complain about it the way we do now. They endured it, swallowed it, lived alongside it. And nowhere was that more evident than in the forge, where pain wasn't just tolerated. It was routine. Burnt skin, pulled muscles, split knuckles. These weren't emergencies. They were just the price of working with fire and iron. The blacksmith knew this better than anyone. Pain was his shadow. It lingered in his joints, buzzed in his fingertips, curled around his spine each morning like a familiar weight. So when someone came to him screaming, panicking over a broken finger or an infected wound, he didn't flinch. He didn't pity. He braced their arm, handed them a stick to bite, and did what had to be done. There were no sedatives, no ether, no laudanum, no sweet relief from the agony. At best, a mouthful of strong ale. At worst, a leather strap shoved between teeth and the hope that you'd black out before the worst of it was over. Pain was not treated. It was endured. It was a measure of your grit, your worth, your survival. Men prided themselves on staying silent, while the blacksmith drove a hot iron into a festering wound. Women clenched their jaws, while he pulled a stubborn tooth from the back of their skull. Children learned quickly that tears didn't change the outcome. The fire would still burn. The hammer would still fall. The cure, such as it was, would still hurt more than the sickness. And yet, no one thought it barbaric. Because everyone knew someone who hadn't survived an untreated wound. Everyone had lost a cousin to a simple cut, a neighbor to a rotting tooth. So pain was a bargain. You gave a scream and some blood, and in return, you might get your life back. The blacksmith didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't soothe or explain. He simply acted. He held the limb firm, counted silently, and then snapped it into place or burned it shut. And afterward, the silence was almost reverent. The screaming stopped. The patient, trembling and drenched in sweat, would be helped to their feet or carried home. And the blacksmith? He'd wipe his hands, dunk his tools back into the forge, and get back to shaping iron like nothing had happened. There was a strange kind of resilience born in that fire-lit brutality. People didn't expect comfort. They expected results. Pain was a part of healing, just like heat was a part of forging. You couldn't have one without the other. And over time, even children learned that lesson. They watched their fathers come home with bandaged arms. They listened to the stories of neighbors who'd been burned to survive infection. And they grew up knowing that pain wasn't something to avoid. It was something to master. The blacksmith didn't remove pain from their lives, but in a strange way, he taught them how to face it and survive. The forge was already alive when the two men came in, one limping heavily, the other half carrying him, their faces tight with panic and dust. The injured man's boot was soaked with blood, and with every step, he let out a strangled hiss, the kind of noise that meant something had gone deep and fast. A rusted nail, they said, stepped on while hauling wood through the old churchyard. It had gone clean through the foot, and now it jutted out from the leather like an iron thorn. There was no time to waste. Infection could set in before the sun went down. But there would be no doctors, no beds, just the forge, the blacksmith, and the grim choreography of medieval trauma care. The blacksmith didn't say much. He rarely did. He took one look, gave a grunt that might have meant sympathy, or simply calculation, and gestured for the man to sit on the low bench near the fire. The injured man tried to lower himself, but the pain made him jerk back, howling. That's when the other one, the neighbor, stepped in. "Just hold still," he said, voice low, hands already gripping his friend's shoulders. No one asked if he was ready. No one asked if he wanted to wait. This wasn't a choice. This was survival. The blacksmith reached into the coals with his tongs, pulling free a tool that shimmered with dull red heat. Not glowing. He didn't need to cauterize, not yet, but hot enough to sterilize. He cooled it slightly in a trough, wiped it on a thick rag, then knelt beside the foot. No prayers, no apologies, just a nod. "Don't move," he said. The scream came the moment the iron bit down around the nail's shaft. The man on the bench thrashed, arms jerking wildly, but his neighbor tightened his grip and forced him back. Muscles strained, eyes rolled back. Then, with one sharp pull, it was over. The nail came free, followed by a small fountain of blood, dark and thick, and steaming in the forge's heat. The blacksmith pressed a pad of boiled cloth against the wound and held it there, silent as the injured man gasped like a drowning sailor. No words passed between them, only the sound of breathing and the faint hiss of iron cooling once more. He wrapped the foot tightly with linen strips soaked in a bitter-smelling poultice the herbalist had left behind days earlier. Then he lifted the foot again and reached for the cautery iron, just in case. A quick press, a hiss, another scream, and the wound was sealed. Brutal, efficient, necessary. There was no margin for error, no time to consider if it could have been done another way. This was the way. When it was finished, the neighbor helped the man stand, and together they limped out into the morning light, one of them pale and shaking, the other quiet and grim. The blacksmith said nothing. He dunked his tools in water, stoked the fire, and turned back to the iron, waiting on his anvil. Another wound, another scream, another day. Just hold still. There was a certain rhythm to cauterization, though no one would call it graceful. It was not the dance of a healer in flowing robes, or a gentle priest whispering blessings over the sick. It was raw, jarring, and violent. A performance where the blacksmith, the wound, and the fire all played their parts in a brutal kind of ballet. When the call came, another rider thrown from his horse, a boy gashed by a broken tool, a soldier dragging himself in with a deep slice through his thigh. Everyone knew what to expect. They didn't call it surgery. They didn't even call it healing. They called it burning. And they knew it worked. The blacksmith would begin by clearing the forge, pushing aside the tools meant for shaping metal, and preparing the space for flesh instead. The fire was already alive, always alive, and he would feed it, coaxing the coals until they glowed like molten eyes. The cautery rod was long, heavy, tipped with a flat circle or a pointed brand, depending on the job. It wasn't used often, but when it was, it had to be perfect, heated evenly, not too fast, not too slow, just until the iron was the right color. A dull orange meant it was ready. Too cool, and it wouldn't sear properly. Too hot, and it might do more harm than good. As the tool heated, the room would quiet. The injured man, or woman, or child would be laid down on a flat bench, held by 2 or more strong arms. Sometimes they were sober, sometimes they were drunk, sometimes they were already unconscious from blood loss. It didn't matter. The blacksmith would nod once, and the room would hold its breath. Then, in a single fluid motion, he would press the iron to the wound. The sound came first, a horrible wet hiss as flesh sizzled. Then the scream, sharp and immediate, echoing off the stone walls like a war cry. Smoke rose from the skin, carrying with it the sickening scent of burning meat, and for a moment it would feel like the forge itself had turned on the person beneath it. But that was the point. The heat sealed the wound, killed the infection, stopped the blood. It was pain distilled into its purest form, delivered quickly, with brutal precision. And yet, in the midst of all that chaos, there was control. The blacksmith moved with certainty. He didn't flinch. His grip didn't shake. He knew exactly where to press, how long to hold, when to pull away. He had seen enough wounds to recognize the line between too much and just enough. His timing, his pressure, his silence, it all became a kind of choreography. Crude, but effective. Terrifying, but life-saving. When it was done, the tool went back into the coals, the smoke cleared, and the patient was left scarred, but alive. The crowd, if any had gathered, would disperse in silence. The blacksmith would wash his hands in a basin of warm ash water and return to his forge as if nothing had happened. But for those who had witnessed it, the memory of that cauterizer's dance would linger. The heat, the scream, the iron, the flame. A ritual of pain that more often than not pulled life back from the edge. When infection took hold, it didn't announce itself politely. It crept through the body like a curse, swelling flesh, blackening skin, turning a simple cut into a death sentence. There was no understanding of bacteria, no knowledge of how it spread, but the villagers recognized its signs. A wound that refused to close, skin that pulsed with heat, a stench that signaled something inside had gone rotten. They'd tried herbs, prayers, poultices. Nothing worked. And so, when all else failed, they turned to the only force they feared more than the sickness itself: fire. The blacksmith didn't advertise the service, but they came, limping, pale, with trembling hands and desperate eyes. They asked, or sometimes didn't, just looked at him, then at the fire, and waited for the nod. He'd seen enough to recognize it, the kind of infection that spread fast, that no cloth could stop. And so he prepared. A thin rod, a flattened piece of iron, sometimes just the tip of a chisel, heated until it glowed orange. The patient was restrained, one man at each limb, a third holding the head. There were no words of comfort, just a sharp intake of breath, and then the iron came down. It was called branding, but this wasn't about ownership. It was survival, a precise strike to burn out the rot. The iron hissed against skin, steam rising in a sickening plume. The patient screamed, bucked, cursed, begged. Sometimes they fainted, sometimes they didn't, but the pain was necessary. It seared the wound shut, stopped the infection in its tracks. The logic was cruel but simple. Burn what's sick before it spreads. It wasn't a guarantee. Some still died, but many didn't. They limped away days later, scarred and sore, but alive. The scars were unmistakable, circular, raw-looking, sometimes branded in lines where the infection had spread deep. They became a kind of badge in the village, proof that you'd looked death in the face and let fire drive it back. People talked about it in whispers, about the girl who nearly lost her leg after a dog bite, saved only by the blacksmith's hot blade, about the farmer who cut his hand on a rusted plow and came back a week later, red-eyed and sweating, and left with half his palm burned clean, but the fever gone. It never got easier for the blacksmith. He never grew numb to the screaming, but he didn't stop. Because when the infection came knocking, he was the last door between life and a shallow grave. He didn't offer hope. He offered flame. He offered pain. And somehow, again and again, that was enough. People would pass his forge and glance at the tools hanging near the fire, not just hammers and horseshoes, but that flat piece of iron, that branding rod. They'd shudder, then walk on. They knew what it meant. They knew what it had done. And they knew that if infection ever came for them, they'd come back. Because sometimes, the fire saved what nothing else could. In the medieval world, where the line between the natural and the supernatural was paper thin, the blacksmith occupied a strange position, part laborer, part magician, part priest of fire. His forge wasn't just a place of metal and muscle. It was, to many, a site of unseen power. Fire was sacred, iron was feared, and the blacksmith, standing at the center of it all, seemed to channel forces most villagers barely understood. So it made a certain kind of sense, twisted by time and belief, that some blacksmiths began crafting not just tools and weapons, but talismans, rings of iron, amulets hung from leather cords, charms hammered with strange runes or wrapped in cloth, soaked in herbs. These objects weren't just tokens. They were protection, healing, hope in tangible form. People believed in the power of iron, not just for strength, but for purity. It was said to ward off illness, to repel evil spirits, to keep nightmares at bay. Mothers would come to the blacksmith asking for a small iron ring to slip onto a child's wrist to keep away the fever. Old men, coughing and weak, begged for a charm to tie around their necks, a piece of the forge, they said, to keep death from entering their lungs. The blacksmith didn't claim to understand it, but he'd seen enough to know that belief, when mixed with desperation, was a force of its own. And so he made them. The rings were simple, rough-hewn bands of dark metal, sometimes stamped with a mark of the forge, sometimes left plain. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to carry weight, the weight of tradition, of fear, of silent prayers, hammered into shape. Some blacksmiths added designs, symbols passed down from older generations. Crosses, stars, spirals. Not because they meant anything to him, but because the villagers asked for them. Said they worked, said their grandmothers wore the same. There were stories, of course. Stories of children who stopped coughing after wearing an iron ring, of fevers that broke in the night, of nightmares that never returned once the charm was hung above the door. The blacksmith never argued. He let the stories grow, let the people talk. Maybe it was superstition, maybe it was coincidence, or maybe, just maybe, the iron remembered the fire and passed that strength along. Sometimes he wondered about it himself. There were days when he felt something hum through the metal, not the heat, not the weight, but something quieter, older, a rhythm beneath the ringing of the hammer. He'd never say it aloud, never admit that he, too, sometimes wore a small iron band around his wrist, hidden beneath soot and leather, just in case. In a world ruled by uncertainty, where sickness came like wind and death wore a dozen faces, people reached for whatever gave them comfort. And if that meant trusting a piece of iron, born in the belly of the forge, then so be it. The blacksmith understood. He didn't promise miracles, but he gave them iron, shaped, cooled, worn close to the skin, and sometimes that was enough. There was no pain, quite like a tooth gone rotten. It wasn't the kind of agony you could ignore. It crept into the jaw, throbbed through the skull, turned sleep into torture and food into misery. In a world without dentists, even the smallest infection in the mouth could drive a grown man to tears. And when the pain became unbearable, when the gum swelled, when the fever rose, when the nerves screamed with every heartbeat, there was only one place left to go: the blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith didn't claim to be a dentist, but he had what was needed: pliers thick enough to grip, arms strong enough to pull, and fire hot enough to sterilize. It wasn't delicate work. He'd reforge a pair of tongs into something closer to pincers, narrower, ridged, designed to bite back against enamel. They weren't crafted with finesse. They didn't need to be. The job wasn't about saving the tooth. It was about removing the pain, quickly and permanently. The patient, if you could call them that, would sit on a stool or lie back on a bench, mouth open, eyes wide, usually gripping the arms of a friend or relative. Some bit down on leather. Some prayed. Some drank until they couldn't stand, hoping alcohol would do what medicine could not. The blacksmith would heat his tools, wipe them with a cloth soaked in something bitter, if there was time, and then lean in. One hand to steady the jaw, the other to clamp the tooth. The scream, when it came, was like nothing else. Sharp, guttural, ancient. It echoed through the forge, louder than the hammer, louder than the fire. And then, with a sickening twist and a pull, the tooth came free, sometimes whole, sometimes in bloody fragments. But not every blacksmith relied solely on brute force. Some, over time, began to learn the value of herbs and spirits. Numbing roots like wild lettuce or clove were chewed before the procedure. Strong homemade liquor, distilled from whatever fruit or grain could be spared, was swirled in the mouth to dull the nerve. A few smiths even kept small bottles of their own herbal mixtures. Potent, foul-smelling concoctions brewed in soot-blackened kettles and stored in clay flasks. They couldn't stop the pain completely, but they made it just bearable enough to endure. And sometimes, that made all the difference. The blacksmith never enjoyed this part of the job, but he understood it. Pain like that could drive a man mad, and pulling the tooth, however violent, was often the only way to bring someone back from the edge. There was no aftercare beyond rinsing with warm water and praying the hole didn't fester. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it healed clean. Either way, the patient always left looking different, paler, weaker, but lighter somehow. The pain had been torn from them, root and all, and left behind in the ashes of the forge. And so the tradition continued, year after year. The blacksmith became not just a maker of tools and weapons, but a remover of pain. He wielded iron like mercy, hot, heavy, and final. No certificates, no anesthetics, just fire, muscle, and the grim promise that by the time you left, the worst would be over. Some days the forge didn't smell like fire and steel. It smelled like blood, thick, coppery, unmistakable. The kind of smell that clings to your throat, not just your clothes. It wasn't every day, but when it happened, it transformed the space completely. The blacksmith's domain became something more than a workshop. It became a battlefield clinic. The anvil, usually reserved for shaping tools and horseshoes, turned into a table for injured limbs. The barrels of water used for quenching iron served as wash basins for wounds. The same tongs that bent metal pulled arrows from flesh. The hammer, the chisel, the glowing poker, all of them turned from creation to destruction and back again. The day might begin normally. Fix a hinge, shape a nail, refit a plow blade. But then a scream in the distance, running footsteps, a man dragging another over his shoulder, blood dripping in a steady trail behind them, a woman clutching her stomach with a broken knife handle still lodged in her side. In those moments, the forge changed. Tools were pushed aside, the fire was fed, and the blacksmith's face took on a grim stillness, not panic, but readiness. He didn't need to be told what had happened. He didn't ask. He just got to work. The floor would be soaked within minutes, first with sweat, then with blood. The air turned thick, not with the usual metallic tang of iron filings, but with the sharp, nauseating sting of open wounds and scorched flesh. When he cauterized a wound, the smell was unbearable. The sickly sweet burn of human skin being sealed shut by fire. Smoke from the forge mingled with the haze rising from flesh, blurring the room into something almost surreal. You couldn't breathe deeply. You didn't want to. It was during these times that the blacksmith's strength mattered most. Not his arms, but his resolve. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. When someone screamed, he didn't comfort them. He held them down. When someone bled, he didn't look for a clean rag. He grabbed whatever cloth was closest. When bone needed setting, he did it with a snap. Brutal, quick, and if it didn't heal perfectly, at least it healed. Villagers would sometimes wait outside during these moments, unwilling to enter, but unable to walk away. They heard the screams, the clang of tools, the hiss of the iron. They saw the smoke and knew it wasn't just metal being forged in there. It was life being fought for. And when it was over, the blacksmith would emerge red to the elbows, face blank, not looking for thanks. He'd dump his bloodied cloths in a trough, scrub his hands with ash, and go right back to his work, as if nothing had happened. The forge was many things: a shop, a sanctuary, a symbol of strength. But on certain days, it was a place of pain, a place where blood mixed with soot, where the hiss of healing was louder than the ring of steel, and where the man who shaped iron also shaped fate. One cauterized wound, one torn tooth, one scream at a time. The blacksmith didn't go to school. He didn't study anatomy. didn't read scrolls about humors or bloodletting. He never wore robes, never took an oath, and couldn't name a single bone in the human body. And yet, somehow, people still came to him when things went wrong. Not because he was trained, but because he was effective, because he had done it before, and someone had lived. That was the only credential that mattered in a world where most people died from a bad wound or an untreated fever. If the blacksmith had pulled a tooth and the patient survived, word got around. If he cauterized a gash and the bleeding stopped, that was good enough. Reputation replaced certification. Survival replaced proof. His education came not in lecture halls, but in blood-soaked moments of panic. He learned to set a bone by watching a shepherd writhe in agony and figuring out, on the spot, how to twist the limb back into place. He learned how deep to push a heated poker into a festering wound because he once didn't push far enough, and the man died. He didn't repeat that mistake. Every lesson came with consequence. Every success was paid for in screams, sweat, and scars. There was no time to study, no second chances. The stakes were always immediate and always brutal. Sometimes he learned by watching others. A traveling tinker who reset a dislocated shoulder with a single jerk. A midwife who used a flat stone to compress a wound until the bleeding slowed. A wise woman who brewed a tea that dulled pain just enough to get through the burn. He watched, he remembered, and when the time came, he tried it himself. If it worked, it became part of his practice. If it didn't, he found a new way. There was no room for pride, only function, only survival. And the thing was, it worked. Not always, not perfectly, but more often than anyone else in the village could manage. While learned physicians, miles away, dissected pigs and debated theories about the star's influence on bile, the blacksmith was elbow deep in the real stuff: shattered bones, infected wounds, screaming mouths. He didn't understand why his cauterized tools seemed to keep wounds cleaner. He just knew they did. He didn't know what bacteria was. He just knew that reheated tongs worked better than ones left cold. No one asked him for a diagnosis. They came for a fix, for action. And in that sense, he delivered. His hands were clumsy but precise. His tools were crude but effective. There were no guarantees, but there was something almost comforting in his unflinching directness. He didn't promise to cure. He promised to try. And often, in a world where even trying could be rare, that was enough to make him the most trusted man in town when everything else had failed. He wasn't a doctor. He was something older, rougher, more immediate. No training, just results. No theory, just fire. And in a world teetering on the edge of survival every single day, that made him more valuable than any parchment ever could. He never asked to be anything more than a smith. That was all he'd ever wanted: to work the fire, shape metal, keep the village supplied with nails, hinges, tools, horseshoes. His trade was already hard enough. Days spent sweating beside a roaring hearth, hands blistered, arms aching, lungs blackened with soot. That life was more than enough for most men. But over time, the blacksmith found himself shouldering a second role, one he never trained for, never sought, and never entirely accepted. The village didn't crown him a healer. They simply handed him the wounded, and he did what no one else could, what no one else would. It began slowly: a child with a dislocated arm, a man with a festering wound, a scream from the fields that echoed into the forge. At first, he tried to refuse. He told them he wasn't a doctor, that he didn't know what he was doing. But when someone's wife was dying from an infection and the nearest physician was 3 days away, What choice did he have? He had heat. He had blades. He had strong hands and the kind of steady mind that didn't collapse under pressure. He didn't want the responsibility, but no one else was stepping forward. And so, he became the town's reluctant hero. Not by grand gesture or ceremony, but by accumulation. One injury at a time. One survival at a time. People stopped asking if he could help. They simply brought the wounded to him and waited for him to act. The title of healer was never spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It hung in the air, like the smoke that clung to his hair and skin. It followed him through the streets, in the way people looked at him, the way they stepped aside, the way they knocked on his door late at night, with blood on their clothes and fear in their eyes. He didn't like it. Not because he didn't care. He cared too much. Every time he pressed hot iron to a wound or pulled a tooth from a sobbing child, it carved something out of him. He wasn't immune to the screams. He just couldn't let them stop him. And each time he succeeded, he felt the weight grow heavier. Because next time, they'd expect it again. And one day, he might fail. But still, he answered. Every knock, every plea. He never turned anyone away, even when he was exhausted, even when he knew the odds were slim. Not because he wanted to be a savior, but because he knew the cost of doing nothing. He'd seen too many people buried for lack of a steady hand. So he worked, quietly, relentlessly. And the forge, already a place of transformation, became something more. It became the heart of the village, pulsing with heat, pain, and survival. He never claimed to be a hero. But when the time came, when the bleeding wouldn't stop or the bones snapped clean through, everyone knew where to go. Not to the priest, not to the woods, to the forge, to the blacksmith, to the man who never asked for this, but who never looked away. It wasn't common, but it happened often enough to be remembered. A woman in labor, screaming in a dark cottage, the midwife struggling. Something was wrong. Too much blood. The baby turned the wrong way. The mother too weak to push. There were no doctors. There were no hospitals. Just mud floors, a bed of straw, and the rising panic of women trying everything they knew and coming up short. And when the screams turned frantic, and the midwife's voice cracked from shouting, someone would say it, almost in disbelief. Get the blacksmith. It wasn't because he had the right knowledge. He didn't. It wasn't because he wanted to be there. He certainly didn't. But he was close. He was strong. And more than that, he didn't freeze when things got desperate. The blacksmith had seen blood. He knew what it meant when a body bucked under pressure, when something had to be pulled or pushed or forced. He'd reset bones. He'd pulled teeth from screaming mouths. Compared to that, the act of birth, though terrifying in its own way, was something he could face without blinking. And so he came, wiping soot from his hands, ducking into the small, smoky rooms that reeked of sweat and fear. The midwife would give him one sharp look, half warning, half plea, and he'd move where he was told. Hold her legs, press down, lift the mother when she collapsed. He followed orders, used his weight where it was needed. Once or twice, he reached in and pulled, guided by trembling instructions from a woman who had delivered dozens before. But never one quite like this. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. Just did what had to be done. The mother screamed. The baby emerged, slick and shrieking. Sometimes it was alive. Sometimes it wasn't. But the smith had done his part. No skill, no training, just presence, just steadiness in a storm of panic. And when it was over, he stepped back, hands red, eyes unreadable, and left quietly through the door. Back to the forge, back to iron and fire, the world he understood. It wasn't spoken of much afterward. There was no shame, but no ceremony either. He wasn't a midwife. He didn't want to be. But in the chaos of medieval life, where the line between survival and death was always razor thin, someone had to be strong enough to show up. Someone had to be able to act when others faltered. And sometimes, that person was the same man who shoed horses, fixed cartwheels, and pulled infected teeth. People didn't call it medicine. They didn't call it heroism. It was just what needed to be done. And the blacksmith, with soot still clinging to his skin and hammer-calloused hands still shaking slightly, never refused. Because there was no one else. Because time was short. Because if he didn't help, the crying might never start. Doctors were for the rich. Everyone knew that. They rode in on fine horses, wore clean robes, and quoted books written in Latin no one in the village could understand. Their hands were soft, their eyes distant, and their prices always beyond reach. A single visit could cost more than a family's winter food. And so, for most villagers, the idea of medical care wasn't even a dream. It was a cruel joke. They didn't have silver. They didn't have coin. What they had were chickens, loaves of bread, a few good nails, maybe a patched cloak, or a sturdy length of rope. Things that couldn't buy a physician's time, but could get the attention of the blacksmith. He never turned people away. Not because he was a saint, but because that wasn't how the village worked. Everyone traded. Everyone helped, or no one survived. You brought your daughter's twisted ankle to the forge, and in return, you brought eggs the next morning. You asked him to pull a tooth from your father's head, and a week later, you mended his fence or left a wedge of cheese at his door. It was unspoken. There was no ledger, no list. Just the slow, quiet exchange of survival. Some days he'd find gifts waiting in the early light. A basket of onions, a bundle of herbs, a fresh loaf still warm. Not payment exactly, gratitude. A way to say, "You saved my brother's hand," or "My son can walk again." He never asked for more. He didn't tally his kindness. He simply nodded, placed the offering beside the forge, and kept working. The villagers knew they could go to him without shame, that he wouldn't demand what they couldn't give, that he would treat the wound first and worry about repayment later, or not at all. That mattered. In a world ruled by feudal lords and greedy churchmen, the blacksmith was a rare kind of power, one that worked with his hands, not with contracts. And because of that, people trusted him more than any noble or knight. He lived where they lived, ate what they ate, bled when they bled. He became the village's unofficial physician, not because he wanted the title, but because he was there. Because he charged what people could afford, not in gold, but in trust. Sometimes it was a sack of flour. Sometimes it was simply the promise of help come harvest time. A kind of health care rooted not in wealth, but in community. If someone had nothing, they still weren't turned away. The blacksmith had already decided that saving a life was worth more than a pig or a pile of firewood. So when the bleeding started, when the bone broke, when the fever raged, they didn't waste time praying for a doctor. They went to the forge, because in the roar of the fire and the weight of the iron, they found something better than money. They found someone who didn't ask what they could pay, only what hurt and how fast it needed fixing. When the plague came, it didn't knock. It kicked the door down. One day the village was humming with routine. The next it was a whisper of panic and boarded windows. People stopped gathering. Streets emptied. The church bells rang more for death than for prayer. And as the sickness crept from house to house, fevers, boils, bloody coughs, those who could afford to flee did so quickly, vanishing into the woods or locking themselves behind stone walls. Even some priests disappeared. Physicians, if they came at all, didn't stay long. They prescribed prayers and powders from behind gloved hands, then vanished with their silver. But the blacksmith stayed. He didn't stay because he was brave. He stayed because he had nowhere else to go. His forge was his life, and his life was tethered to the village. So while others fled the coughing and the stench of decay, he remained, smoke curling from his chimney, long after the bakers had gone cold and the tavern doors were shuttered. And because he stayed, the people came to his forge, pale and weak, desperate and scared. Some needed help. Others just needed proof that someone was still working, that life hadn't entirely unraveled. He did what he could. When the local gravedigger collapsed, the blacksmith stepped in to nail coffins shut. He crafted crude stretchers for the sick, hammered boards across abandoned homes to slow the spread. When there were no masks to be found, he made them from scrap leather and thin metal, shaped with his heavy hands and lined with whatever herbs the village healer could spare. They weren't perfect, but they covered the face. They gave people the illusion of safety, and sometimes that was enough to keep them from breaking. People who wouldn't have dared enter the forge weeks before now showed up trembling, with skin blotched purple and eyes glassy from fever. The blacksmith didn't recoil. He held them up. He cleaned their wounds. When the boils came, he lanced them, cauterized the cuts, burned the linens they left behind. He knew it might kill him. But still, he worked. The fire was his only constant. The forge stayed hot, even as the village went cold. It became the one place that still moved, still made noise, still offered the strange comfort of routine. When others died, he helped carry the bodies. When others refused to touch the infected, he held their arms down, dressed their wounds, pulled their teeth. No gloves, no mask, just ash-stained hands and the kind of resolve that couldn't be taught. And somehow, not always, but sometimes, people survived. The boy with the gash across his chest, the woman who collapsed in the street, the child who screamed through the night until the fever broke. They lived, not because he had the cure, but because he didn't run. In a time when fear ruled everything, the blacksmith became something rare, a figure who stayed in place while the world crumbled. He didn't call himself a hero. He didn't even speak of what he'd done. But long after the plague passed, when the bells finally rang for something other than mourning, the village remembered the man who kept his fire lit, not just to shape iron, but to hold the darkness back. For all their usefulness, blacksmiths walked a razor-thin line between respect and suspicion. They worked with fire, shaped metal with nothing but heat and willpower, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, seemed to know things no ordinary villager should. They didn't pray over the sick. They didn't invoke saints. They didn't quote scripture. And yet, people came to them in the dead of night to fix what priests couldn't: a festering wound, a shattered limb, a screaming child with fevered eyes. The forge became a place of unspoken rituals, where iron hissed against skin, and suffering was silenced, not with blessings, but with glowing steel. It wasn't long before the church took notice. To the village, the blacksmith was a figure of brute salvation. To the clergy, he was something more troubling. He healed without holy water. He soothed pain with roots and red-hot iron, not prayer. He worked with wise women and herbalists, people already under suspicion for their knowledge of plants and their habit of speaking truths the church hadn't sanctioned. His forge produced talismans and iron rings that villagers wore like armor, convinced they protected against illness or evil spirits. To some priests, this was a dangerous kind of power. healing that didn't come from God, influence not bestowed by the church, but earned by sweat, strength, and silent endurance. Whispers followed him, that he used fire to drive out demons, that he spoke charms over the wounded, that he consorted with women who brewed potions by moonlight. The line between healer and heretic was thin, and the more he succeeded, the thinner it got. There were places, darker corners of the countryside, where blacksmiths were accused of sorcery, simply for doing what needed to be done. A man who could set bones, pull teeth, and burn away sickness without ever once crossing himself. That looked too much like magic to those who didn't understand it. And fear, especially in times of plague and famine, was always searching for a target. The blacksmith knew better than to argue. He kept his head down. He made his offerings. When a priest asked for nails for a new chapel door, he made them fast and free. When someone asked where he learned to cure infections, he said nothing at all. Let them think it was instinct. Let them think it was luck. He had seen too many good people, midwives, herbalists, travelers, dragged before village councils and accused of things no fire could burn clean. And still, the people came, even the ones who crossed themselves when they passed the forge. Because when the fever came back, or the wound opened again, they didn't go to the pulpit. They went to the anvil. They went to the man who didn't promise miracles, but delivered something better, a second chance. In the end, it was the results that protected him, not the church, not the law, but the quiet understanding that when death knocked, the blacksmith answered, not with scripture, not with incense, but with iron. And with that, sometimes came life. In some villages, especially the ones tucked far from cities and beyond the reach of any real church authority, the blacksmith became more than just a man who shaped iron. He became something close to sacred, not in the formal way, not with robes or titles or incense, but in the eyes of the people who watched him every day, pull order from fire, fix what was broken, and bring the suffering back from the brink with nothing but tools and resolve. He was the one who held the line between chaos and continuity. And in time, they began to look at him with a kind of reverence usually reserved for priests. They called him the Iron Priest, though never to his face. It started as a whisper, a nickname passed among old women and nervous fathers. The smith wasn't ordained, but he worked miracles of a different kind. He didn't recite prayers. He breathed life into cold metal. He didn't bless people, but they left his forge healed, braced, scarred, but saved. His anvil was his altar, his fire a sacred flame, his hammer a kind of sermon, and each act of shaping, fixing, cauterizing, pulling, pressing, these were his rituals. The forge, a place where transformation occurred, not just for iron, but for bodies and lives. Children would watch him from a distance, wide-eyed, as he lifted glowing blades from the coals, as if witnessing the work of a demigod. They heard the stories, how he'd set a man's arm after a fall from the mill roof, how he'd sealed a soldier's gut with a red-hot brand, how he once pulled a tooth so bad it left the patient speaking in tongues for an hour. The line between story and fact blurred, as it always does. But that only deepened the myth. Even adults treated him differently. They approached his forge with quiet respect. Not fear exactly, but something close to awe. The way they'd step back when he was working, the way they'd lower their voices when speaking to him, like entering a holy place. And when illness swept through the village, or when a cart rolled over a child's leg, no one thought twice about where to go. They didn't wait for the priest. They went to the Iron Priest because he'd act, because he didn't wait for divine permission to do what had to be done. Some even left small offerings on his doorstep: candles, bits of bread, herbs, trinkets. Not payment, not exactly, but thanks, devotion. A sign that they saw in him something larger than life, something that bridged the gap between the human and the eternal. After all, what else do you call a man who stands in the fire, reshapes the world, and does it not with blessing, but with blood? He didn't embrace the title. He didn't need to. He knew his place was not in the chapel, but in the forge, where heat met flesh, where iron bent to will, and where the suffering came not for absolution, but for the only kind of salvation they could truly understand: survival, hammered out one glowing stroke at a time. For all the grim respect the blacksmith earned, no one ever pretended his methods were perfect. His forge may have been a place of survival, but it was also a place of pain, and sometimes failure. There were days when the screams didn't end with relief, when the patient didn't limp away, but was instead carried out on a wooden board. Not every bone reset properly. Not every cauterized wound healed. The line between saving a life and making things worse was razor thin, and the blacksmith, for all his grit and instinct, walked it blind. He never claimed to be a healer. He never promised success. But desperation has a way of blinding people to risk. And when there were no doctors, no medicines, no alternatives, people came to him with wounds that were already too far gone, limbs blackened with infection, eyes clouded with fever, bellies swollen with pus. He did what he could, but sometimes the body just couldn't take it. A cautery iron pressed too long, a splint that didn't hold, a tooth pulled that opened a jaw to rot. The results were devastating. People died. Or worse, they survived in pieces. There were those who lost entire limbs after a bad procedure. A broken leg turned gangrenous after a failed attempt to reset it. A man who never spoke again after a tooth extraction went too deep and damaged his jaw. A young boy who went into shock after a wound was branded, only to stop breathing hours later. These were the moments that haunted the forge, the failures that clung to the blacksmith's hands long after the blood had been washed away. The village whispered, but rarely blamed. They understood the odds. They understood that doing nothing often meant certain death, and the blacksmith, at least, tried. Still, there were looks, quiet avoidance in the market. The mother who crossed the road rather than walk past him. The father who stopped bringing offerings after his son limped home, worse than before. He bore it all in silence. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He just went back to his fire and waited for the next knock at the door. Those who came after a failure always hesitated. They'd look at the soot-stained tools, the dark rags by the door, and ask, will it hurt? Or worse, will it work? And the blacksmith would say the only thing he could: I'll try. He didn't hide the risks. He didn't dress them up in false hope. But he knew the alternative. He'd seen what happened when people did nothing, when they let the infection run, when they let the wound fester, when they waited for help that never came. His cures were brutal, often incomplete. But sometimes they bought time, bought a life. And in a world that offered no guarantees, that was more than enough for most. The scars left by his mistakes ran deep, but so did the gratitude of those he managed to save. And so the forge remained open, the fire kept burning. Because even if the cure wasn't always clean, it was a chance. And sometimes, a chance was all that stood between a grave and another sunrise. The forge was never a welcoming place. It wasn't built for comfort, and it certainly wasn't built for the weak of heart. The fire alone was enough to make most people hesitate, roaring, alive. hissing with each gust from the bellows like some ancient beast. The heat pressed against you the moment you stepped near, wrapping around your lungs, stinging your eyes, making your skin feel like it might blister just from standing too close. The air reeked of smoke and sweat and scorched metal. Sparks leapt from the hearth without warning. Tools hung like weapons from the walls, hammers, tongs, irons bent and blackened by use. It was a place of force, of raw, unforgiving labor. And yet, when pain came, real pain, the kind that settled in your bones or festered beneath your skin, people walked into that fire. They feared it. Make no mistake. No child approached the forge without clinging to their mother's skirt. Even grown men stood stiff at the threshold, eyes flicking to the glowing tools, the soot-covered figure of the blacksmith moving through the haze like a shadow. The fire wasn't just dangerous, it was symbolic. It burned things away, it transformed, and transformation was never painless. Everyone knew that. But still, they came. Because as terrifying as the forge was, what they carried with them was worse. Infection, rot, swelling that wouldn't go down, teeth that screamed pain through the skull, a wound that stank of death. These weren't discomforts, they were omens. Everyone had seen what happened to those who ignored the signs. They watched neighbors swell with fever until they stopped breathing. Watched children waste away from something as small as a splinter turned septic. So they came to the one place in town where something might still be done, where someone might still try. They came afraid, yes, but also with a flicker of desperate hope. The blacksmith saw it in their faces, the tension, the way they stood too straight, too still, as if bracing for a blow. Some spoke bravely, asking for help in gruff tones. Others said nothing at all, just lifted a sleeve or opened a blood-stained tunic to reveal the damage. They didn't come expecting kindness. They came expecting pain and a chance to live through it. The forge offered no gentleness, but it offered action. And in a world where most suffering was met with shrugs or prayers, that meant everything. The blacksmith didn't comfort, he didn't bless, but he didn't hesitate either. He grabbed the iron, he held the limb, he did what others wouldn't dare. People feared the forge, and they had every right to. But when death knocked louder than the roar of the fire, they stepped into the heat. Because fear, in the end, is a lesser enemy than the silence that follows an untreated wound. And in the fire's glow, even with the pain, the smoke, the scars, there was at least the chance to keep going, to limp out the door instead of being carried out the back. His hands told the whole story. You could see it in the way his fingers bent slightly wrong from years of gripping too tightly, too often. In the dark lines where soot had settled into every crease, every joint. In the patches of skin that no longer felt pain, nerve endings long ago seared away by glowing iron or boiling oil. The blacksmith's hands were not beautiful. They were not clean, but they were the most capable hands in the village. They had fixed carts and closed wounds. They had reshaped blades and held broken bones steady while a child screamed. These were the hands of a man who had stitched his life into the lives of everyone around him, not with thread, but with fire, pressure, and pain. Each scar had a story. The raised welt across the palm where he gripped a tool too hot to wait. The knuckle flattened from a misjudged hammer strike. The deep groove along the thumb from the time he cut leather for a splint in a rush and didn't stop to care for himself. They weren't battle scars in the way soldiers wore them. They were something different, not proof of violence, but of endurance, of necessity, of countless days spent doing what no one else could or would. Those hands moved with surprising gentleness when they had to, Despite their bulk, despite the calluses thick as bark, they could handle delicate work when a life depended on it. They could twist iron into a horseshoe and, in the next breath, cradle a swollen foot and cut away a poisoned nail. They could lift a wagon wheel and later reset a dislocated shoulder with the same calm force. There was no pause, no need to wash away the work of the forge before beginning the next task. It was all one motion, one purpose: fix what was broken, whether it was wood, steel, or flesh. Villagers learned to recognize the feel of those hands, the way they steadied your wrist before a pull, the firm clamp on your arm before a reset, the reassuring pressure of a bandage wrapped tight and right. Children, especially, remembered. They might dread the forge, fear the pain, but they never doubted the hands that held them through it. There was something absolute in that grip, something that said, without words, "I've done this before. You'll survive." He never wore gloves, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because gloves dulled sensation. He needed to feel the heat, the tension in the metal, the way something shifted when it was about to give way. That same sensitivity applied to people too. He could feel when a bone was ready to move, when a tooth was about to break loose, when pressure had to shift, when force had to soften. It wasn't magic. It was experience, burned into skin and muscle over a lifetime. Those hands were never idle. Even when he sat, he was sharpening something, wrapping something, testing weight or grip. They were the village's hands in a way, reliable, strong, scarred beyond recognition. The kind of hands you didn't just trust to build a plow or shoe a horse. You trusted them to set a leg, close a wound, and hold you together until you could stand again. Tucked behind the soot and steel of many forges were things you wouldn't expect. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from rafters, jars of thick black salve lined up beside the tongs, wax-sealed bottles filled with pungent oils and strange powders. Most blacksmiths wouldn't admit to being healers in the herbal sense, but that didn't mean they didn't know things. Not everything in their toolkit was iron and fire. Some had recipes, old whispered instructions passed down from a grandfather or an aunt, kept folded in a drawer, or simply memorized from years of use. Remedies that weren't found in books, because no one who used them could write. They were handed down by calloused fingers, tested on wounds that had no time to wait, and refined by fire and desperation. It might have been a salve for burns made from goose fat and comfrey, stirred until it smoked just right. A paste of honey, ash, and crushed garlic packed into a wound to draw out infection. A bitter tea brewed from willow bark to dull pain, poured slowly between the lips of someone shivering with fever. The ingredients changed from village to village, depending on what could be grown or gathered. But the principle was always the same. If it helped even once, it was worth remembering, even if no one understood why, even if the explanation was more myth than science. Some of the recipes bordered on ritual. A poultice had to be applied at dusk, or wrapped in a certain cloth, or blessed under a full moon by a woman who knew the words. It was half medicine, half magic, or maybe just faith dressed in the language of superstition. But in a world without certainty, people clung to whatever worked. And more often than not, it was the blacksmith who prepared it. Not because he believed in spells, but because he believed in results. Because he'd seen the swelling go down, seen the fever break, seen the child who wouldn't stop coughing finally sleep. He kept these things quietly, tucked behind heavy benches or in the corners of tool chests. Sometimes he sent someone to fetch a certain herb from the edge of the woods. Sometimes he borrowed a pinch of powder from the herbalist down the road. And when no one else was watching, he'd mix the ingredients by feel. No measurements, just memory, just instinct shaped by experience. People never talked about the salves as much as the surgeries. They remembered the burns, the extractions, the cauterizations. But often, it was these quiet concoctions that truly made the difference. A wound treated with heat might still fester without something to soothe it. A bone reset might swell unless the right poultice was applied. The forge's fire got the credit, but the little jars and bundles beside it often finished the job. To some, it looked like sorcery. To others, it was just survival with an extra layer of care. But to the blacksmith, it was simply part of the work. Fix the metal, fix the limb, and when all the pulling and burning was done, seal the wound with something passed down long ago, something no one fully understood, but that, for reasons no one could explain, still worked. In the dim light of the forge, beneath the hiss of steam and the hammer's ringing cry, another lesson was always being taught. Not one of words or writing, but of watching, repeating, absorbing. The blacksmith's trade was more than just bending iron and shaping tools. It was a way of life passed from father to son, from uncle to nephew, one burned hand at a time. And with it came not just the knowledge of metal, but the rough, hard-earned wisdom of healing. Because when your father pulled a tooth from a screaming man, you learned how to brace the head. When he reset a broken leg with a splint carved from wagon wood, you learned how to hold it steady. You learned when to heat the iron, when to stop the bleeding, when to say nothing and act. It wasn't spoken of openly. The fathers didn't sit their sons down and say, "This is how you heal." They showed them. And the sons, knowing they would one day inherit the forge, inherited the responsibility along with it. They memorized the motions. They practiced on animal bones. They saw the screams, the shaking, the blood, and learned not to look away, not to hesitate, because hesitation in this trade could mean a lost arm, a lost life, and a lost reputation that took generations to rebuild. Sometimes the boys resisted. It was one thing to shape a horseshoe, another entirely to hold a red-hot iron to a man's skin. But the day always came, the moment when the elder blacksmith was away, or too weak, or already gripping another patient, and someone screamed for help. A child fell, a man crushed his hand, a woman went into labor, and it was the apprentice's turn. No time to question, no room for fear, just the fire, the tools, and everything they had ever watched being done. And in that moment, something passed on. Not just skill, but duty. A quiet, brutal legacy. You weren't just the man who made hinges and repaired axes. You were the one they came to when everything else failed. You were the one who stayed when others ran. And just like the iron you worked, you were forged into that role by heat and pressure. It wasn't always a willing inheritance. Some sons bore the weight with resentment, others with grim acceptance. But over time, most came to understand the strange honor of it. The forge wasn't just a place of labor, it was a place of last chances. And knowing how to shape iron wasn't enough. You had to know how to shape survival. That meant passing on the salves, the splints, the knowledge of how to pull a nail from a foot or stop the rot from climbing a leg. These weren't things you found in books. They were passed from scarred hand to scarred hand, generation after generation. And so, even as the names changed, the fire kept burning. The work continued, and the sons who once looked away learned, in time, to step forward. Because someone always had to. Because healing, in a place like this, wasn't a profession. It was a burden and a birthright. In a village where most days passed in quiet routine, stories traveled fast, and nothing spread faster then gossip about pain and healing. Everyone wanted to know who had been hurt, who had survived, and more importantly, how. When someone came back from the edge, stitched, splinted, or scarred, the tale raced from one doorstep to the next. Whispers filled the fields and hearths. He pulled the tooth clean. She walked again after he braced her knee. Did you hear? He set the broken wrist before the bone turned black. In a world without newspapers or records, reputation was everything, and the blacksmith's reputation was carved into every conversation, like a mark on the village walls. People talked as they drew water, shelled beans, or tended goats. A grandmother would tell a child about the time the blacksmith saved her husband's arm. A merchant would lower his voice over ale to describe how the smith burned the rot out of his brother's leg with a poker and poultice. Some stories were true, others were wildly exaggerated, but all of them added to the legend, reinforcing the forge not just as a workshop, but as a place where things and people were fixed. It wasn't the blacksmith's intention. He never asked for praise, but he couldn't stop the talk, nor did he try. He just kept working, hammering metal in the background, as his name was passed from one mouth to another. When a stranger came into town, limping, and asked where to go, they were pointed toward the forge before they even reached the inn. He's helped worse, someone would say, confident but grim. And that confidence mattered more than any title. It meant people believed, even if they feared him, even if they swore they'd never set foot near the fire, unless they had no other choice. And that was the pattern. No one went to the blacksmith casually. They waited until the pain grew unbearable, until they'd tried the herbalist's teas, the priest's prayers, and the healer's charms. Then, finally, with hope nearly gone, they turned to the man everyone whispered about. The one with burned hands and blood-soaked rags. The one who, according to half the village, had saved a dozen lives, and according to the other half, had almost taken a few too. Even his failures became fuel for stories. They didn't tarnish his name. They deepened the mystique. He couldn't save her, someone would say in a hush, but he tried harder than anyone else. That trying was what mattered. That willingness to act, to face pain when others turned away. It turned the blacksmith into more than a craftsman. It made him a figure of quiet power. Not beloved, not revered, but known. And in a village where being known could mean the difference between trust and suspicion, that mattered more than anything. So the gossip flowed. Not because people loved drama, though they did, but because in the blacksmith's smoke-filled forge, they found a strange comfort. A reminder that when everything else failed, there was still someone willing to lift the iron, press the wound, and try. There was a grim poetry to it, how the same hands that tried to pull you back from death might also be the ones to carry you to it. In many villages, there was no undertaker, no professional mourner, no team of carpenters tasked with building coffins. There was the blacksmith. He had the tools. He had the wood, and he had the silence needed to do the work without flinching. If he couldn't save you, he would bury you. Not out of duty, but out of necessity. He was the beginning and the end, the last attempt to keep you breathing, and the first to shape the box you'd be buried in when breath finally stopped. The forge never paused for grief. The fire still needed feeding. The tools still needed shaping. But on some days, the clang of metal was replaced by the dull, rhythmic knock of nails being driven into pine. The air, instead of smelling of scorched iron, took on the sharp scent of sawdust and sap. The blacksmith would shape the planks himself, measure the body, and hammer the lid shut with the same focus he gave to every other task. There was no ceremony in it, no lamentation, just the quiet rhythm of labor. Sometimes the family would watch from a distance, red-eyed and silent. Sometimes they couldn't bear to. It wasn't easy. Not when it was a child whose arm he'd tried to save. Not when it was a friend whose leg he'd splinted just days before. The failure hung in the air, not in words, but in the weight of the wood. He remembered every cry, every procedure, every desperate glance. And now, all he could offer was a well-fitted box and a promise that the earth would take the body cleanly. He hammered slowly on those days, not because his hands were weak, but because something inside him was. Villagers noticed. They didn't say much, but they saw the overlap, the way life and death were both shaped in the same space. The forge, which had once seemed like a place of salvation, also became the last stop on the road to the grave. The same smoke that curled up during a cautery session now rose while the blacksmith burned old wood scraps for a cremation pyre. If the family chose fire over burial, and people learned to live with that duality, that a place of healing could also be a place of endings. In time, it became accepted, even expected. The blacksmith was the one you turned to when you wanted to survive. And when you didn't, he was the one who saw you off with dignity. There was no priest's sermon that meant more than the blacksmith hammering shut the lid with care. No velvet lining could compare to the rough handmade box shaped by a man who had tried, really tried, to save you. And so, life and death blurred at the forge. Sparks flew for both the living and the dead, and the man at the center of it all kept his fire going, not just to shape tools or splints, but to make sure no one left this world without being held by his hands one last time. No one came to the blacksmith expecting comfort. They came expecting pain, sharp, immediate, and unforgettable. But they came anyway, because in a world where infections could kill faster than wolves, and a bad fall might mean slow death by fever, pain was a currency people were willing to spend. The treatments he offered were brutal. Cauterization with glowing iron, splints bound with rawhide and soot, teeth ripped out with tools never meant for a human mouth. But when villagers weighed their options, the logic always came out the same. Better this than dying. It was a grim sort of mantra, whispered between clenched teeth, muttered through sobs as someone was held down on the floor of the forge. Better than dying. It justified the screaming. It gave people something to bite down on, literally and figuratively. They'd heard the stories, seen the bodies. They knew what happened when you left a wound untreated, when you ignored a fever, when you let a rotting tooth poison your blood. They'd watched neighbors go from limping to buried in a matter of days. So when the blacksmith said, "It'll hurt," they nodded. What didn't? There was no fantasy about what the forge offered. No one believed it was a miracle. It was survival, stripped to its most elemental form. Pull the tooth, or rot from the jaw inward. Burn the wound closed, or bleed into the dirt. Set the bone with a scream, or never walk again. These weren't choices so much as consequences, measured out in flesh. And in the face of those consequences, even the most terrified villager would drag themselves or their loved one to the forge door and knock. The blacksmith didn't coddle them. He didn't offer reassurance. He gave them a stool, a leather strap to bite, and a warning. Don't move. That was it. The rest was action. Swift, exacting, sometimes messy, but rarely indecisive. He didn't have the luxury of uncertainty. Pain was part of the deal, and everyone knew it. The screams echoed down the village streets, and still, the next one came. Because when the moment came to choose between agony and death, pain always won. And afterward, after the wailing stopped, after the blood was cleaned and the iron cooled, there was silence. Not peace, but survival. The patient might be pale, trembling, faint with exhaustion, but they were still breathing. And that meant the pain had done its job. That was the quiet truth behind every horror that took place in the forge. It worked. Not always, not cleanly, but often enough to keep hope alive. And so the villagers bore it, gritted their teeth, screamed, wept, fainted, endured. Because in the end, the blacksmith's fire hurt less than the grave. It was cruel, it was raw, but it was, undeniably, better than dying. The older villagers always had stories. Around fires in the dead of winter, over bread and broth on long, quiet evenings, their voices would drop into that low, reverent tone that only came out when they were talking about things that truly mattered, things that had once stood between life and death. And more often than not, the stories were about the blacksmith. Not his blades, not his tools, not the fine gates he forged, or the wheels he repaired. The stories were about his hands, his fire, the way he pulled a man back from the edge using nothing but hot iron and sheer will. They remembered the screams, how they pierced the air when the smith set a bone or pressed a cautery rod to a wound. But even louder, in their memory, was the silence that followed. That moment when the pain stopped, when the bleeding slowed, when the fever broke. That's what stuck with them. Not the agony itself, but the fact that someone had survived it. And always, it came back to the forge. Children sat wide-eyed as elders told of a boy who had fallen from the mill roof and shattered his leg. The bone was sticking through the skin, someone would say. We thought he'd die by morning. But the blacksmith set it, burned it closed, braced it with metal and leather. The boy walks with a limp now, sure, but he walks. Or the tale of the girl who coughed blood for 3 days, her skin pale as wax. The priest gave her last rites, but the smith and the herbalist made a strange brew, packed her chest with steaming cloth, and kept the fire burning all night. She married a brewer in the next town, they'd say, as if that was proof enough. These weren't written stories. No parchment carried them. They lived in mouths and memories, passed down with the same reverence as family lineage. Even the smith's failures became legend, not as shame, but as testament to the fact that he'd tried. He'd held the dying in his arms. He'd pulled teeth with tears in his eyes. He didn't save everyone, but he faced every scream, every plea, every impossible moment. And that mattered more than anything. The stories echoed long after the pain was gone, long after the smith himself had grown old or even passed on. Sometimes the forge would still stand, tended by his son or apprentice, and the stories would continue. That's where he set old Tom's shoulder, someone would say. That's the table where he pulled 3 arrows from a knight's chest. And the fire, still crackling, seemed to remember too. In a world where history belonged to the rich and parchment belonged to the church, the blacksmith's legacy lived in the mouths of the poor, in whispers, in warnings, in tales told at dusk to children who would one day grow up and, when the time came, go to the forge themselves. Because stories keep us alive. And the stories of the blacksmith, the man who healed with flame and grit, were too important to be forgotten. In the grand halls of history, when the story of medicine is told, the names carved in stone are usually those of scholars, physicians, and saints, men who wrote books, founded institutions, or wore robes that commanded respect. But for the villages tucked far from cities, where illness struck just as fiercely and wounds bled just as deep, those names meant little. The real defenders, the first line of aid for the poor and the desperate, didn't wear white. They wore soot. Their robes were leather aprons. Their tools were blackened with ash, not polished with silver. They were the blacksmiths, the untrained, uncelebrated hands that kept rural life from unraveling entirely. They never called themselves doctors, and no one else did either. But look closely, and it becomes impossible to deny. When someone broke a leg, it was the blacksmith who said it. When a tooth rotted and pain became unbearable, it was the blacksmith who pulled it. When infection bloomed like rot in a wound, it was the blacksmith who burned it away with iron and grit. No training, no lectures, just generations of trial and error, calloused instinct, and the kind of hardened calm that only comes from doing what must be done again and again. He had no Latin phrases to explain what he was doing, but he had results. When a farmer walked again after a crushed foot, when a boy stopped screaming after his shoulder was reset, when a woman lived another year after her abscess was drained and sealed with fire, those were his credentials. The proof wasn't in ink and seal, but in scars and breath. He was there when it counted, and in the absence of access to real medicine, that made him indispensable. His forge became the town's quiet clinic, not out of design, but from desperation answered. People came, not because they wanted to, but because they knew no one else would act. And while others crossed themselves and waited, the blacksmith picked up the tongs and did what he had to do. He may not have cured disease in the scholarly sense, but he did something more important. He bought time. He stopped the bleeding. He stabilized the limb. He made it possible to survive another night, another winter, another infection. And yet, history barely mentions him. No monument, no recognition. But how many lives were saved, not by a physician's pen, but by a blacksmith's hand? How many children owe their lives to a crude splint or a burnt wound? How many elders lived long enough to tell their grandchildren stories because one man stood between them and the grave, with no promise of reward and no assurance of success? The blacksmith wasn't just a maker of tools. He was, by every measure that mattered, a rural medic, a field surgeon, a last hope. He deserves his place in the story of medicine, not at the margins, but close to the fire where lives were truly forged, not in ivory towers, but in smoke, sweat, and blood. Imagine a villager, dirt under their nails, a fever behind their eyes, a festering wound on their leg that smells wrong and seeps worse. Who do they turn to? A physician, if one is nearby, might come draped in robes, armed with theory, herbs, and a purse that expects payment. He'll speak of humors, astrology, and draining the bad blood. He may carry leeches, he may prescribe prayers, but will he act? Will he touch the wound, grip the limb, clean the infection, set the bone? Maybe, but probably not before explaining why Mars is out of alignment, or why bile must be balanced before the body can heal. Now picture the blacksmith. No robe, no credentials, just fire, leather, and tools, shaped more by necessity than design. He doesn't explain much. He looks at the wound, grunts, and starts heating the iron. He won't debate causes. He'll stop the bleeding. He won't talk about infection. He'll burn it out. He won't theorize about balance. He'll splint the leg so it can carry weight again. The difference is clear, not just in outcome, but in philosophy. One man studies, the other acts. Physicians came from towns or moved from castle to castle, chasing coin and reputation. They weren't always welcome in poor villages, and even when they were, their solutions were often more dangerous than the ailment. Bloodletting for fevers, purging for stomach pain, sometimes even trepanation to let the spirits out. Their hands were soft, their methods were slow, and their presence was rare. Most villagers saw a physician once in a lifetime, if ever. The blacksmith, on the other hand, was always there, in the center of the village, with soot on his face and heat at his back. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask about coin. He set bones with the same calm he used to bend steel. He pulled teeth with iron meant for horses. He burned wounds closed with rods made to shoe oxen. It wasn't elegant, but it was immediate, and more often than not, it worked. The villagers knew this. They talked about it behind closed doors and around the fire. When a child fell from a ladder and broke her wrist, they didn't ask, "Where's the doctor?" They asked, "Is the blacksmith home?" Not because he was trained, but because he got results. The man in robes might have knowledge, but the man with the hammer had experience. The man with the hammer had courage. The man with the hammer had seen more blood than most soldiers, and he still kept his hands steady. So who was more helpful? The physician who came once a year, spoke like a scholar, and left before the fever peaked? Or the blacksmith who stepped into fire every day, and when the time came, stepped into danger to save his neighbors too? To the medieval villager, the answer wasn't in degrees or titles. It was in scars that healed, teeth that stopped aching, children that lived, and time and again, it was the blacksmith, not the physician, who delivered. It was well past dark when they arrived. Two younger men, soaked to the bone, dragging an old man between them like a sack of broken bones. One leg dangled wrong, twisted beneath his body, his face pale and grimacing with each bump along the road. The forge's fire was low, the bellows quiet, the day's work already put aside. But the moment the blacksmith saw them at the edge of the light, he was already moving. No questions, no scolding, just action. He tossed a handful of coal into the hearth, pressed the bellows, and brought the forge back to life. The old man had fallen from a cart, they said, out by the edge of the fields, far from help. The bone had snapped clean, jagged and sharp beneath the skin. It would swell. It would fester. It would kill him if it wasn't reset, splinted, braced, and done now. The blacksmith knelt beside him, gently pressing the swollen leg, watching the man's breath hitch. He didn't speak. He didn't promise it would be fine. He simply gave a look to the younger men. Hold him down. The iron tools weren't made for this, but they'd served before. He reached for the splint boards kept near the wall, roughly carved from wagon planks. He took a length of boiled leather and sliced it into straps. The water was already heating. The fire glowed brighter with each pump of the bellows. The forge, usually loud with hammer and steel, was quiet now. Just the crackle of flame, the low murmur of the wind outside, and the patient's shallow, rasping breaths. He reset the leg with a swift, awful motion. The snap echoed off the forge walls, and the old man let out a sound like a wounded animal before falling silent, unconscious, or close to it. Then came the bracing. Tight, firm, 2 splints on either side, bound with steaming cloth. The swelling would come fast. The blacksmith packed the joint with a mash of herbs left behind by the village healer. He didn't know the mix, but he trusted it. His fingers, as large and burned as they were, moved with strange gentleness as he wrapped the foot, checked the angle, bound it again. It wasn't perfect. It never was. But it would hold. Hours passed. The other men sat in silence, heads bowed, eyes fixed on the floor. When it was over, the blacksmith sat back, covered in sweat and soot, chest heaving, hands shaking just slightly from the long night and the memory of pain. No one offered coin. No one expected him to ask. He never did. There was no price for what he'd done, not because it was priceless, but because it wasn't about profit. They carried the old man away, careful now, the leg wrapped and stiff. He would heal if the fever stayed away, and even if it didn't, he had been given a chance. That was all the blacksmith ever promised, a chance. He returned to the fire, stoked it once more, and began shaping a blade he hadn't finished earlier. No applause, no blessing, just another emergency, faced and met. The forge flickered around him, the night deepening outside. He didn't look up. He didn't stop. He didn't need thanks. He had his fire, and that was enough. The blacksmith's legacy was never carved into stone. No statues were raised, no songs were written, but his mark was everywhere, hidden in the living. In the man who walked with a limp because a splint had held. In the woman who could still chew because he had pulled the right tooth at the right time. In the child whose fever broke after a poultice was packed by firelight. His name might not appear in books, but his legacy was stamped into iron and flesh. The survival of people who, without him, would have been lost. He was never just a maker of swords. The blades rusted, the horseshoes wore thin, the tools broke, were reforged, broke again. But the lives he saved, those remained, quietly, without fanfare. The healing he offered wasn't gentle. It was crude, scarred, and screamed through clenched teeth. But it was real. He shaped survival with the same intensity he used to shape steel, folding fire and instinct into something life-saving. He didn't ask for the role, but he fulfilled it again and again, because someone had to. His forge was more than a workshop. It was a crossroads where death paused, and life was given a second chance. Every time he heated the iron, every time he turned from the anvil to a wounded body, he crossed a line few were willing to touch. He wasn't taught how to heal. He learned because there was no one else. His tools were forged for metal, but they mended flesh. His instincts were sharpened by failure, refined by pain, and proven through repetition, not theory. Villagers remembered, not in plaques, but in stories, not in titles, but in gestures. How they nodded respectfully as they passed his forge. How they knocked softly, even when the need was desperate. They remembered in scars that faded over decades, in arms that still moved, in jaws that still chewed. And when the blacksmith was gone, and his fire passed to another, the memory remained that he was more than a tradesman. He was the one who stood between the body and the grave when no one else would. His legacy wasn't metal. It was the act of doing, the courage to try, the strength to hold when others turned away. In the end, the blacksmith wasn't just the man who forged the village's tools. He helped forge its people, their stories, their resilience. He shaped not just the iron, but the lives that leaned on it. And his fire, once burning only for steel, became something far greater. A quiet, enduring flame that carried lives forward, one painful, necessary act at a time.